welcome back. Today I have some library books to share with you. You all know that I like to do library book hauls and reviews because I love the sounds of library books, tapping and page turning, and these lovely sticky library book covers. And today, this is a very special episode of Devan's library book reviews because the first two books I'm going to talk about today were recommendations from you. Whenever I do book hauls like this, I will probably put these all down now because they're heavy and just start making sounds with one of them. But whenever I do book themed videos, I always ask in the comments about what you're reading and if you have anything to recommend. And I'm really grateful whenever you do comment and start a conversation about books. I find it really fun and interesting to discuss books with all of you. And so today I have two books that were recommended to me by subscribers in the comments. And then I have one more book thrown in just to round things out. So thank you to all of you who participate in the literary discussion here on Quiet Comfort ASMR. We combine the lovely sounds of books with some conversation about books. And these book-related videos are not always my most popular videos compared to some of the more traditional ASMR themes that I do sometimes. And so I just really appreciate all of you who do comment and like and watch these videos because I really love doing them. Books are a big part of my life and I really like sharing them with you. And I really do think they make for good ASMR. So if you're one of my book people out there, give me a little shout out in the comments. Let me know. Give me a suggestion of something you'd like me to read and talk about. It's just very rewarding and satisfying for me, and one of the ways that we can make this channel really interactive, and I really enjoy that. So, this first book that I have was recommended to me by a subscriber named Courtney. Thank you, Courtney. Courtney and I have had some really good conversations about books in the comments section of these videos, so I appreciate that. And this book has quite a lengthy title. It's written in this lovely script here on the front. It is called The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Marianne Shaffer and Annie Barrows. And this is a book that takes place right after the end of World War II, and some of the characters are in London and some are on the island of Guernsey, which is one of the Channel Islands, one of the archipelago of islands in the English Channel, which was something I wasn't really even fully aware of until I read this book. So it was very informative to me in a lot of ways. I love learning through fiction and historical fiction. And this book is unique because it is written entirely in the form of letters and correspondence written between the characters. And that's just a really cool format and way to go about storytelling, I think, and a real challenge, I would imagine, for the author. And so I just thought it was really cool to read that, and definitely a challenge for the reader too, as it's just a different way of processing the information and processing the stream of the narrative and sort of processing the plot and getting to know the characters. And I like the way she laid it out. She did, at the beginning of each letter, she says at the top who it's to and who it's from, so you don't have to flip. If the letter is a couple of pages, you don't have to flip to the end and make sure you know who this letter is from, because there is quite a lot of correspondence between quite a few different people in this book. So you need to keep track as you're reading. And I would say at first, it is a little tricky maybe to keep track of all the characters. So just keep that in mind if you decide to read this. Give yourself a little time to get acquainted with everyone as you're going through. So the main character in this book is a woman named Juliet, and she is a writer, and she lives in London and is just completing a book tour for a book that she wrote. She was a columnist during the war and wrote kind of a satiric, humorous column in a newspaper during the war, and it was very popular and was made into a novel. So she has been on a book tour for that novel and is now kind of ready to put that voice and that persona that she was using for that column behind her and start on her next book. And through a series of charming, serendipitous events, which I will not reveal in case you want to read the book, she begins corresponding with a man named Dawsey, who lives on the island of Guernsey, and they begin writing each other and getting to know each other, and he tells her about the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, of which he is a member. And this is a book discussion group that sprang up among a group of neighbors on the island as sort of a matter of necessity one night. And again, I won't reveal all the details of that, of how it came to be, but Guernsey has been under German occupation for 4 years, right before the time that this novel is set in. So that's what a lot of the correspondence and a lot of the stories that he is sharing with Juliet, and then eventually other members of the society also share their stories with Juliet about what it was like during these years of German occupation on the island. And I found it historically very interesting because that was not something that I really knew much about. And I will say that this is a book that deals with some very heavy subjects because we are talking about World War II, and there are some chronicles of concentration camps and very tragic things that were happening to people during this time period, and what was happening to the people on Guernsey Island as they did not have enough resources, they didn't have fuel for heat, they didn't have enough food. And so it's a very serious topic. It's a very serious time in history as people were trying to rebuild after the war, literally rebuild the structures and the infrastructures of their cities and towns, and also trying to rebuild their lives and somehow process all the trauma of war that they had been through and then try to move forward in their lives. So it's a very serious subject matter, but the characters in this book are so wonderful, and their personalities and their quirkiness and just the resiliency of their spirit really shines through. And so it's just a very human, I would say it's a very human way of learning about that historical period. So I hope that makes sense. And I liked it because, as I said, it really shows the resiliency of the people who lived through these extremely challenging times. But it's not like sugar-coated, it's not saccharine and sort of sweeping and like, and the human spirit prevailed kind of thing. The grittiness and the truth of what happened is there, but it's written in a way that is very uplifting and really focuses more on the courage and the resiliency and the kindness and the generosity of the people and how they worked together to support each other, and kind of the nuances of the occupation and the Germans who were there, and how some of them were doing things to help the people living on the island, and it wasn't this black and white thing of good and bad and who was the enemy and who you could trust. And it's just very nuanced in the writing. And a big theme of this book is the value of books. I feel like I shouldn't tap the entire time I'm doing this. In case you're not a tapping person, I'll just do some other sounds with the books if I can. But the value of books themselves. And during this time, which was very challenging, and the island was cut off from a lot of communication with the outside world, and they were very isolated, but the books that they had were such a resource to them. And this group of neighbors who gets together and talks about the books that they are reading and how resourceful that is for all of them. And the members of this society are not your typical literary types at all. They are farmers and laborers and normal everyday people. And so it's just really inspiring the way that different books affect all of them, and some of their reviews and opinions about the books, which are quite irreverent. And it's a very funny book. That's the thing. It's a very serious subject matter, but it's a very, very funny book. And so when I read it, I laughed a lot. There were times when my heart was very broken to think about this period in history and the things that people had to endure. But overall, it was a very positive read. And so I definitely would recommend it. And whenever I talk about books like this, I don't know if I'm making sense or if I'm doing them justice, but those are my thoughts. And I did write down a few things. Yes, I wanted to mention that it really brought up for me the value of written letters, of correspondence, and how that's something, that we don't really do very often in this current age. We email, we text, we use social media, but the handwritten letter through the mail is much more of a rarity. And I am a person that I do like to write a good old-fashioned handwritten letter. I write a lot of cards to people in my life, and it really brought home to me and strengthened my resolve to write more written letters, because I feel they're very powerful and they convey a kind of an emotion and a connection between people that can't be conveyed through any other medium. And it also really just struck me in this, of course, the pace of correspondence and people having to be patient in receiving letters from one another. And of course, also the way people conducted research and things like that. If you wanted to know something, you didn't just go look it up on the internet. You might write some letters to different people that you knew who you thought might be knowledgeable about this subject, as well as seeking out libraries and resources and references and things like that. But it just seems like there was so much more information shared between people and expertise about things shared between people via letters and correspondence. And it was just really, that was a very interesting element of this book, and got me thinking a lot about modern communication and some of the things that perhaps we have lost, things that we have sacrificed for the speed and accessibility that we have gained. So just something interesting to think about. Let me see. And of course, I do always have to give a few critiques if I have them. And I will tell you that there is a romance element throughout this novel. It's just one thread of the novel. It's not solely a romance novel, but there is a romance throughout this novel. And one of my critiques is that, and you all know if you've watched any of my other book review videos, that I do sometimes get a little impatient with romance novels or with the romantic elements in books, because I get frustrated with people when they're being really stubborn about showing their true feelings, and when they're sort of willfully misunderstanding one another, which I find happens a lot in romance novels. So towards the end of this book, there was an element of that for me, of a kind of like, oh, come on, don't you see the truth in this? Don't you see why this person is doing this? Don't you see how they really feel? But I guess that's just one of those things that I have to accept, and which I guess is true about life, that sometimes people who are quite intelligent and quite insightful are not always so intelligent and insightful when it comes to romance and relationships. And I liked these characters enough to forgive them for that. And related to that, my other critique is that when the romance does come to a head at the end of this book, and I don't want to give too much away about it, but I was a little disappointed that the romance itself doesn't really become revealed through letters. The whole book is written through letters, and then there's this part at the end where suddenly it switches for a little period of time, and instead of letters, you have kind of journal entries and observations from one of the characters of what she is observing about what is going on with characters around her. She's kind of trying to be a detective in a way. It's part of one of the plot elements, and so she's noting down all her observations about the people that she's friends with in her community. And it's that section of the book in which the romance comes to a head and feelings are revealed and the couple gets together. And that was okay, but because the whole rest of the book is written in letters, I was a little disappointed and felt a little cheated because I was confident that this romance would come together, and I really wanted to read the letters that these two people would have written to each other to reveal their feelings. And I felt a little bit cheated out of not getting to read the confessional love letters that I thought would be coming, particularly from one of the characters. I wanted to read what he would have said in his letter of love to this person that he had grown to care for. And it just felt a little bit like the author didn't quite know what to do with that, or quite how to actually get the romance to come to a crux without abandoning the letter format. And so I will also say, I looked up a little more about this book. It does have two authors. Mary Ann Shaffer was the main author, and in reading a little bit about this book, she actually became ill towards the end of her writing of this book. And so her niece, Annie Barrows, who is also an author, kind of took on the task of finishing up the book. And so I'm just curious, I'm not sure, I couldn't say for sure, but if maybe that passing of authorship might be one of the reasons that the ending was a little different than I expected. And I'm glad that the novel was finished, because I did really enjoy it, but that dual authorship may have had something to do with the way that ending came together. And this was Mary Ann Shaffer's first novel, I believe, and I believe there's a Netflix series based on this book. I don't do Netflix, so I'm not 100% sure, and I haven't seen it, but I believe that maybe Courtney even mentioned that in her comment, that there is a series for this if you're interested. So, my reviews are always a little lengthy with these books. I think I said everything I wanted to say. And I do highly recommend this book. If I was doing, 4 out of 5 stars, I would definitely give this probably 4.5 stars. I think it is definitely worth reading. It's an easy read. You can read through it quickly. It flows along really nicely. And because of the letter format, you can read it kind of in little chunks and bits and pieces. And I enjoyed it very much. So thank you again to subscriber Courtney for this recommendation. Now, the second book is very different. Very different in style, very different in time period, very different in theme. This book is called The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. And you can see we have sort of this sinister white hand with a ruffly cuff and a scorpion crawling out from the cuff here, and a ring and sort of a chain here, very creepy and kind of gothic looking. And I will say that this is a book I never would have just pulled off the library shelf on my own. It was mentioned in a comment and recommended by a subscriber, Jocelyn. So thank you, Jocelyn, for this recommendation, because I was just really curious about it from Jocelyn's description of it. And so I looked at my library, and they happened to have it. It was right on the shelf. I didn't even have to request it or anything. So I thought, why not? And that's the beauty of a library book. You can check it out and give it a try. And if it's not your thing, you can always just return it. You're not out anything. But I think that for me, I would have seen this cover and the black edging of the pages, which is really cool. But I think I would have seen this and thought, ooh, that's probably too creepy for me. That's probably too creepy and dark for me, because I just have to be very careful about reading that kind of thing because, I don't know, I have an overactive imagination, and if I read scary things, then I'll think about them and dream about them. I don't read horror novels or watch horror movies. I've never read a Stephen King novel. And, you know, I kind of have a duality about it because as far as storytelling, I do like stories sometimes that have that sort of dark, intriguing, magical element, but for me it just has to be done in a way that's not too gory or too graphic or anything like that, because then I just can't handle it. So I decided to give this a try just to see, and I ended up really liking it, which honestly kind of surprised me. So this is another historical novel. This is set in the 1600s in Spain, in Madrid at the time of the Inquisition. And the main character is a young woman in her 20s named Lucia, or perhaps Lucia. I'll probably not do justice to any of the Spanish names in this book that I try to pronounce, so forgive me for that. But Lucia is a scullion maid in a household that is not very prosperous. It's kind of, the family is kind of low on the social ladder and doesn't have a lot of money. And so the master and mistress of her household are always trying to find ways to lift themselves up in the social structure. And Lucia is kind of a plain, unremarkable, unnoticeable type young woman, but secretly she has some magical abilities. She is able to perform what might be called small miracles. She can fix things that are broken. She can cause plants to bloom that have withered. She can sort of regenerate and revive things. And so she keeps this a secret close to her heart because this is during the time of the Inquisition when anything magical or anything like that is very much questioned and can be very dangerous for someone to be involved in. And she has acquired these magical skills from her family. They've been passed down to her in bits and pieces and scraps of language and songs from her aunt, who is still living, and from her mother, who has passed away. Her father has also passed away. And so she uses this magic just in her day-to-day life to assist her in her duties and make her life a little easier where she can, since she does a lot of hard labor and her life is very rough. And I will say now, so I don't forget to later, that's a thing I liked about this book, is that it was very realistic about what day-to-day life would have been like in this time period and doesn't glamorize it as far as, you know, amenities and how people got along and that sort of thing. So one thing leads to another. I won't give away too much of the plot, but eventually she catches the attention of a powerful nobleman who becomes her patron and basically finances her as she develops these skills and powers that she has. And he enters her into a tournament, into a contest against other competitors who also have the ability to perform miracles. And they are to compete against each other, and whoever is considered the most powerful and the most pure will then potentially go to court to serve the king. So there is a lot in this novel about the politics of the time and how people were trying to move in the political circles and better their own standings. And it's also really interesting because during this time of the Inquisition, anything that was considered dark magic or evil or of the devil or anything like that, of course, was very dangerous and could cause a person to be arrested and killed. But there was this sort of twist to it if it was considered to be a miracle and if the person's powers were deemed to be from God, then it was okay and it was desired and it was sort of part of the church and brought into what was acceptable. And so I just think that is very interesting, this thin line at that time between what was considered spiritual and what was considered dark and unacceptable. And I just found that part of it very interesting. So let's see. Oh, there's also this beautiful this is a really beautiful book with the dark pages and these pomegranates on the inside of the book lining. I'll trace some pomegranates for you. So I found the characters very interesting in this book. Lucia as a character and her competitors in this competition. And I liked the way the story was woven together. There is, of course, a romantic element. There is this character, Sant'Angel, who is the familiar who is spoken about on the cover. He is a servant of the noble who is Lucia's patron, and he is engaged to teach Lucia and help her to develop her powers further. And so they have an interesting relationship with a lot of dynamics, and it's not too long before you realize that there will be a romantic element there. And there are lots of hidden agendas and people with secret plots, and you don't know who can trust who and who is really on whose side and who's backing each other up and who's secretly stabbing each other in the back, sometimes literally. And so there's a lot of intrigue in it, and I enjoyed the magical element of it. And I will say there is some darkness in this novel. I mean, it does take place during the Inquisition when a lot of really terrible things were happening to people and people were being persecuted unjustly. And so there is some element of that in here, but it's not overly graphic or anything like that. I could handle it. And this is a very adult novel, definitely adult themes, adult relationships, and adult language and expression in this book. But again, not in a way that was offensive to me, in a way that was appropriate for the book and for the time. And I really enjoyed it. So what's interesting about this is Leigh Bardugo is apparently very popular, and I hadn't heard of her because this, isn't typically my genre of reading. But when I looked up a little bit more about her novels after I had read this, I never read reviews ahead of time because I want to make my own determination. But a lot of people said when I was reading reviews that they actually thought this was one of her weakest novels, that it wasn't nearly as good as some of her other novels and the series of novels. She has several series, I believe, and people were kind of disappointed in this one. So if you're a fan of hers, let me know what you thought, and if you think there is another one of her novels that I should read. I looked at some of them at the library, and some of the covers were way creepier than this cover, and I was like, oh my goodness. So I don't know if I can handle it, but maybe I will try another book of hers. Who knows? Now, my critiques of this one, as far as the writing, I did think there was a bit of disjointedness in the perspective, because I felt like as you went through the novel, different chapters were kind of told from the point of view of different characters. I mean, it was sort of a, all-knowing narrator, but sometimes it was a little difficult when you started a chapter to kind of be like, okay, whose head am I in right now? Like, whose thoughts am I getting and whose perspective is this coming from? And at first I thought it was that it was being told from the perspectives of all the women in the novel, which I thought was kind of cool. But then as it went on, sometimes you were getting Santangel's perspective as well and other people's. And so that was a little disjointed for me. It wasn't so much so that it took away from the overall enjoyment of the book, but I just thought it was a little strange that it seemed like she couldn't quite decide whose perspective she wanted to tell the story from. And then the other thing is that there were quite a few times in here where she was kind of like a future narrator looking back on things and kind of prophesying something. And I liked it. The book starts that way, actually, and I'll read just this first little part to you. The first paragraph of chapter 1 says, "If the bread hadn't burned, this would be a very different story. If the cook's son hadn't come home late the night before, if the cook hadn't known he was hanging around that lady playwright, if she hadn't lain awake fretting for his immortal soul and weeping over the future fates of possible grandchildren, if she hadn't been so tired and distracted, then the bread would not have burned, and the calamities that followed might have belonged to some other house than Casa Ordono, on some other street than Cala de dos Santos." So kind of the idea, if the bread hadn't burned, this would be a very different story. And I kind of liked that. I thought that was a cool beginning. But then I feel like she had a tendency to do that again and again at the end of chapters. It would kind of be like, if they had only known that this was going to happen, then da-da-da-da-da-da. Or if this hadn't happened that day, then maybe everyone's fate would have been different. And I just feel like she overused that a little bit. It kind of got to the point where it was a little bit amusing, where I was like, okay, I get it. Enough of this foreboding, foreshadowing thing. So anyway, so again, not enough that it didn't annoy me enough that it made me not want to keep reading the book. I just thought it was kind of an unusual choice. And then the last thing I will say about this book is that I really, really liked the ending. And I was honestly expecting it to have a really sad, tragic ending. I don't know why, that's just what I was expecting, so I had kind of braced myself for that. And it actually had a more complex and surprising and ultimately somewhat happier ending than I was expecting. And it was one of those endings where it was kind of going along and I thought I knew what was going to happen, and I was like, oh, okay, this is what has to happen, I get it. And so it was like, oh, and then I kept reading and then I was like, oh, okay. And then you keep reading and it was like, oh yeah, I see. And then again it was like, oh, okay, this is how it's actually going to end. So there was a lot at the very, very end where I was kind of like up and down and like, oh, what's going to happen? And I did ultimately like the final ending of the book. So thank you again to Jocelyn for recommending The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. And if anyone has recommendations of any other novels by this author, or any other novels in general that you would like to recommend to me, let me know. Okay, I've been going on for quite some time now, actually. My throat's getting a little sore. So I had thought, how foolish of me that I thought I couldn't fill up a whole video with 2 books. Of course I could. This will probably be an hour-long video. But I did bring one more book with me because it's a different kind of book. Sound-wise, it's a paperback, it's a manga, and this was not a reader recommendation. This is one I just randomly picked off the shelf at the library. It's kind of covered by the library sticker here, but it's called Bungo, B-U-N-G-O, Bungo Stray Dogs. And I picked this up because in the little description it says that it is about an armed detective agency staffed by individuals whose supernatural powers take on a literary bent. And I was like, ooh, literary-based superpowers. Count me in. So I randomly chose this off the shelf. Our library has quite a collection of manga in the young adult section. And because mangas are such a quick read, it's fun to just pick a random one, and then if you like it, you have a whole new series to get into. And I did end up really liking this one. There were characters with a lot of cool powers. It centers around a young man who is an orphan and has been basically kicked out of the orphanage he was in for reasons that don't get explained for a while, but do get explained in this book. And he's out on his own, and through a series of interesting events, he ends up falling in with this detective agency who deals with supernatural incidents that are beyond the police or the military. And all the members of this detective agency are interesting characters with cool powers. And so in just this first edition, in this book number 1 in the series, there were some interesting twists and turns. I was surprised. I laughed. My heart was touched, and I had some ooh wow moments. So it impressed me enough that I am going to get out the next one from the library and see if I want to continue this series. I haven't looked yet to see how many they are. Sometimes when you start a new manga, you're getting yourself in for a long haul. And sometimes they're not quite as long, so we'll see. So anyway, just for one last book, Bungo, Stray Dogs. And usually manga titles, are so hard to parse because they often don't really have anything to do much with the story. Like Bleach is my favorite manga of all time, and it's called Bleach because one of the characters has orange hair, but it's not like he bleaches it, it's just naturally orange. But for some reason that's the title, and the storyline doesn't have anything to do with chemical bleach or anything like that. So, manga. It's such a wonderful, weird world. And this book definitely, some of the characters are weird. There is some very bizarre stuff in it. And that's one of the reasons I love manga, because it's weird and interesting. And the characters always just suck you right in when it's a good one. So, we'll see if I continue with this whole series. I think my library had the first 3 or 4, and then I'll have to start interlibrary loan requesting them, so we'll see if it's good enough to make that commitment. But let me know if by any chance you've read Bungo Stray Dogs, story by Kafka Asagiri, art by Sango Harukawa. Let me know if you've read this, and please let me know if you have any manga recommendations. Because especially with winter, with fall coming, curling up with some manga can be very entertaining. Oh my goodness. Okay, so there were my 3 books, my 2 recommendations from subscribers, and then this one little bonus book. So thank you all for hanging out with me for this long-winded library book review video. Hopefully maybe it's put you to sleep. That would be a good thing. And let me know if you have any book recommendations. if you have any comments on any of these books and what you might like to see in book-related videos to come. So take good care of yourself, rest well, read a good book, and I will see you again soon.